uh, I'm thrilled to be here at the summer seminar. I am always a little bit leery about following Pavlina talking about the job guarantee, because I think there's usually very little more to be said about the job guarantee after she's finished talking. So I'm going to angle into this this subject from a very different point of view. I'd like to begin by talking about a current crisis in the U.S. economy that I think has been, to some degree, people have tended to dismiss it, particularly folks who are aligned with the current administration, either saying that this is a temporary problem or it's not a serious problem. I think it's neither temporary nor is it something unimportant or insignificant. So let me start by talking about an anecdote concerning the town that I grew up in, Amherst, Massachusetts. So in downtown Amherst, there's a shop that was a mainstay of the local business district for about a decade. As of Sunday, June 12th, it closed its doors for business. And this is the Glazed Donut Shop, which I happen to personally be a tremendous fan of. But beset by the impact of the pandemic, like so many small non-franchise businesses across the country, the decisive factor leading to the owner's decision to close was the impact of the current inflation. Facing sharp spikes in the price of eggs, wheat, and other ingredients used in donut preparation, the owners, Karen and Nick Rhodes, concluded that they could not continue. Passing costs to their clients was an unrealistic option when their donuts already were selling for upwards of $4 a piece. The Rhodeses wrote in announcing their decision to cease operations, the increasing pressure of significant inflation on the cost of our ingredients and supplies means that we can no longer produce high quality donuts for a price that we believe people would be willing to pay. In Washington, D.C., inflation has led retiree Joyce Silla to deplete her savings, trying to meet the rising cost of her everyday basic needs. In Houston, Texas, 70-year-old Cynthia Tilfer has returned to work, leaving retirement to meet rising expenses. Senior citizen Bill Teixeira now skips 3 meals a week to cope with rising prices. He fears that further increases in rent will render him homeless. And indeed, there is an evolving homelessness crisis for the elderly who are applying for affordable housing support at unprecedented rates. In general, senior citizens face the classic difficulty that arises when people on fixed incomes are confronted with rapidly rising prices. And in particular, Social Security retirement accounts literally are being exhausted. Inflation today is concentrated in certain sectors, especially gasoline, where the average national price now is $5 per gallon, and in other fuel-dependent products. In fact, gasoline prices have risen by close to 50% over the course of the past year. The annual rate of inflation also has exceeded double digits for airfares, other transportation services, hotel rooms, household energy provision, used cars, furniture, new cars, and basic food items. With the overall annual rate of inflation exceeding 8%, while money wages have been growing at less than half that rate, the downward pressure on families' real purchasing power is dramatic. Inflation is producing a crisis in national well-being. The price surge predates the Ukraine war, so although the supply interruptions caused by the war are an aggravating factor, they are not a root cause. Market power on the part of corporations in the fuel industry does not afford a full explanation for the inflation. There's no reason to believe corporate capacity to manipulate prices to expand profit margins suddenly has become significantly greater in the past 2 years. The primary source of the current inflation is the substantial increase in government expenditure that was enacted to offset the recessionary effects of the pandemic. Federal spending to preserve incomes in the midst of the COVID-19 unemployment shock, inclusive of the Paycheck Protection Program, was not structured to mitigate the inflation risk. A decline in consumer spending was coincident with the income maintenance project because of the sharp rise that we all experienced in sequestering, increased reliance upon remote work, greater dependence on online shopping, and the avoidance of international and domestic long-distance travel. People did not have their normal outlets for household consumption, and correspondingly, they increased their savings. Indeed, by April 2020, the nation's personal saving rate had skyrocketed to 34%, far above the routine 6 to 7% annual rates prior to the pandemic. These increased savings in an environment with limited opportunities to spend led to a condition that I'd like to refer to simply as pent-up demand. Demand that was finally unleashed when the economy was, in quotes, reopened. Without any systematic preparations to ensure that aggregate supply would rise to meet rejuvenated consumer demand, inflation was the inevitable eventual outcome. And indeed, I would argue that modern monetary theorists would have predicted this quite easily. In fact, I think many did. The current inflation emerges in a situation in which you have substantial new government spending without any mechanism in place to ensure that there would be an increase in aggregate supply of goods and services. That's a standard recipe for significant rises in prices. To contain inflation in the absence of a suitable upturn on the production side of the economy, demand has to be squelched. That is, if you want to contain inflation. The fiscal mechanism, higher taxes combined with reduced government spending, lowers incomes across the economy, lowers consumption demand, and thereby puts downward pressure on prices. However, lowering money incomes further in an environment where real wages already are falling is not a promising strategy. The Federal Reserve typically fights inflation indirectly by raising interest rates, hence raising the cost of credit, driving down investment spending, and thereby putting downward pressure on prices. The danger here is when the Fed is sufficiently aggressive in fighting inflation, it can induce a recession. And in fact, there are some fears in the present moment that we might have the worst of both worlds, stagflation or an inflationary recession. During the Volcker era of tight monetary policy, in response to an annual inflation rate that surpassed 13%, the federal funds rate was increased from 11.2 to 20%. The US economy, of course, went into a major downturn. By 1982-83, the overall unemployment rate was above 10%, while the Black unemployment rate, customarily twice as high as the white rate, exceeded 20%. There were, of course, devastating effects on employment and well-being, although by 1983, the inflation rate had fallen to 3.2%. So the Fed's actions were effective in terms of influencing the inflation rate, but there was a very, very high price that we paid as a society. I'm going to argue that it is possible to cushion the economy from the worst effects of a high interest rate induced recession. If the nation had a federal job guarantee in place, it would insulate Americans from the harsh impact of non-incremental increases in the price of credit engineered by the Fed. A federal job guarantee, the assurance of publicly provided employment for every American who wants to work, could function as an automatic stabilizer, expanding to absorb more employees during the economic downswing and compressing to absorb fewer employees during an economic upswing. Since the job guarantee also can function as a core anti-poverty program as well as a full employment program, funding for other social programs to address poverty and unemployment can be reduced drastically to offset the additional expenditures required to finance the promise of employment. And indeed, a federal job guarantee could protect workers' rights because it would eliminate the threat that employers might exercise of job loss. In fact, the federal job guarantee would create a situation in which the public sector would compete with the private sector for workers who are at the low end of the distribution, while simultaneously providing an assurance of employment for all workers in the United States. Anyone who wants to take a publicly provided job under the guarantee would be able to do so. But the competition with the private sector would effectively set a floor on compensation across the entire economy. So whatever is set as the wage rate and as the benefits package for the federal job guarantee would determine the minimum level of compensation across the economy. And in some sense, in that context, it would render reliance upon minimum wage laws or living wage laws unnecessary, because no one presumably would take a job with the private sector unless it provided at least the same degree of recompense that they could receive from the public sector employment. Let me add in this context that in versions of the federal job guarantee that I've attempted to work on, and I believe that that Pavlina has advanced, the idea is that the level of the wage must be sufficient to surpass the poverty rate or the poverty level compensation in the economy, and it also must include a benefits package which is similar to that's available to all federal civil servants, including the medical and health provisions that are present there. Okay. So in setting the floor on compensation, we alter or transform the structure of the American economy. And I would also add that there were potential benefits of having a federal job guarantee in place once the pandemic set in. Let's visualize a world in which the pandemic starts, but we also have a federal job guarantee. This means that there would be a number of benefits. The first is that individuals could avoid low-paid, unsafe employment. And employers who are seeking people to perform that type of work would have to make a concerted effort to first raise pay for those types of jobs, and second, provide the type of protective equipment that would enable people to more safely do the work in which they're making contact with people who might have the disease. Secondly, the existence of a federal job guarantee program would make it possible to have, at any point, a strong core of workers who were available to provide emergency relief. And then third, there would be an opportunity for people to move directly onto a national payroll in the event that unemployment surges as a consequence of a pandemic. We would have had a national payroll in place. There would be no need for a paycheck protection program. And individuals could be moved onto those roles. Their incomes could be maintained, but also they could continue to be at work. And that's really critical, particularly if we're concerned about inflation effects. One of the most important dimensions of a federal job guarantee is that there is actually a production of goods and services, which could mitigate the inflationary impact of the additional federal spending. Okay. Moreover, the job guarantee can generate employment that can meet a wide variety of needs that remain unmet, satisfactorily by the private sector. Some of these forms of employment are things that I think Pavlina emphasized in her remarks. These might include greening the economy in some sense, or the solarization of homes, rejuvenation of our postal system, which has been battered by providing additional personnel from the job guarantee program, and rebuilding our nation's physical and human infrastructure. And by the human infrastructure, I would include additional classroom aides, as well as a professional corps of well-trained child and elder care workers. Moreover, like the Works Progress Administration during the Great Depression, artists could be employed producing creative works. The only limits on the possibilities are dictated by the scope of our imagination. But now here's the connection to inflation, okay? Because most important in the context of an inflation crisis, the job guarantee will ensure that half of the Fed's mandate to promote maximum employment necessarily is fulfilled already. Okay, let me repeat that. Half of the Fed's mandate to promote maximum employment necessarily will be fulfilled as a consequence of the federal job guarantee. I like to say that if we had a federal job guarantee in place, the Phillips curve would become vertical at a 0 unemployment rate. This means in turn that the Fed would be free to concentrate more intensively on the second half of its dual mandate, maintenance of price stability, without as great a degree of concern about the recessionary effects of its policies and practices. Now, given the array of benefits associated with a federal job guarantee, I don't find it surprising that it garners substantial public support. As of October 2019, 70% of American voters indicated that they support a job guarantee program. And indeed, it's bipartisan. 78% of Democrats and 53% of Republicans indicated that they would support a job guarantee. What is more surprising is the fact that despite this immense popular support, elected officials have done very little to establish such a plan. And perhaps this is just another instance of American politics where majority rule is not operative. One final set of remarks I'd like to make before we have a conversation is that the federal job guarantee is the leading edge of what Derek Hamilton and Mark Paul and I have referred to as an economic bill of rights for the 21st century. Our idea is that, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second Bill of Rights that was proposed in the 1940s, the nation should have a set of rights that are assured to all Americans that preserve their capacity to have economic security. And so I would put at the forefront of this the provision of an assurance of well-paid work. And that's the key thing that is provided by a federal job guarantee. But in addition to that, of course, we should actually have a program of national health insurance. We should also have a guarantee of quality shelter for all Americans. We should have an assurance that everyone would have access to Wi-Fi free of cost to individuals. So there's a set of things that should be guaranteed for all American citizens. And at the forefront of this, I would place the federal job guarantee. And let me add, there's an interesting twist here in terms of the political implications that might emerge from having a federal job guarantee. So suppose that the federal job guarantee ensures that everyone who takes the public sector job has an insurance program, health insurance program in place. and this would mean that the private sector would have to make sure that it followed through with adequate health insurance for all of its employees. Otherwise, people would be, once again, less inclined to take the private sector jobs. I would anticipate that corporate America would then insist that the federal government adopt a national health insurance program. And so a federal job guarantee could be the prod that actually leads to the second component of an economic bill of rights for the 21st century, which is an assurance that everybody will have access to decent health care. Okay, so I'll stop there and we can have a conversation.
So thanks for that. You seem to argue that the Fed should be using interest rates to manage inflation. So, but like if raising interest rates really only, would in the first instance lead to higher prices because it's another cost of production, which would be factored into unit costs. The only channel in which it works is by making prices high enough for demand not to reach them, and therefore crushing demand and prices lowering as a consequence of that. If you're then saying we need a job guarantee, if that would then increase demand, what would be the point of the rate hike other than to transfer wealth to owners of capital? I don't see why you would want to raise rates. For any other reason.
I'm not an enthusiast about inflation fighting because I don't think that the tools that we have developed for doing that are satisfactory. But I don't think that there's any significant evidence that in past instances where the Fed has attempted to fight inflation by raising interest rates, that has had as its primary effect driving prices up. Certainly, that's clearly not the case in the Volcker period by any means. So I don't accept your premise that increased interest rates necessarily pass through into higher prices. I think quite the contrary. The increased interest rates lead to a higher price of credit, which leads investment activity to decline. And that's the component of aggregate demand that is reduced as a consequence of that effort. Now, as I said, the danger in that is, of course, you can induce a high interest rate recession. And so that's why you would need a federal job guarantee in place to provide a cushion. I mean, unless we are able to design superior ways to address an inflation crisis or ensure that we don't move into a period of significant inflation in the first place, I'm not sure what other policy tools are available that are, that are palatable to some degree than raising interest rates, and those are only a palatable option if we have a set of protections or forms of insulation for our population from the impact of recession.
Thank you. This is sort of along the same lines. I like what you said about the, getting full employment out of the way allows the government to be more aggressive, I guess, about its attempts to fight inflation. Does that apply kind of the same to fiscal attempts to fight inflation by raising, not just allowing tax revenue to increase passively, but, actually raising tax rates, whether that's the income tax rate or a targeted thing like a gasoline tax or something I'm not proposing either of those things, but does sort of what you said about aggressive policy to fight inflation, does that also apply to fiscal policy? Does it open up sort of the acceptability of some of that more aggressive attempt to fight inflation? And is that a good thing?
So first of all, I don't subscribe to the view that we should liberate fiscal policy to be contractionary. And I don't subscribe to that view because it runs exactly counter to one of the central objectives of a federal job guarantee, which is to maintain people's employment and incomes. You know, if the federal government moves in the direction of raising taxes and reducing its own expenditure, then that's a one almost effectively an offset to the potential benefits associated with a federal job guarantee. So, no, I don't favor the use of the fiscal mechanism, and that's because the fiscal mechanism has far much more of an effect on the well-being of households, whereas the Fed's process has much more of an effect on corporate spending. And so the premise I'm taking is, if we have to fight inflation, let's fight inflation by reducing corporate spending rather than reducing household spending. And so that's why I would steer clear of using the fiscal mechanism altogether.
So in Pavlina's talk earlier, she mentioned the idea that the jobs guarantee would be administered at a local level. You touched on some functions that could be carried out locally, but also larger scale infrastructure projects. The New Deal, of course, featured some particularly well-known examples of large-scale infrastructure projects where workers traveled great distances to participate, such as the Hoover Dam. What do you think about the appropriate level of administration for the job guarantee?
So I think that that whatever decentralization takes place should be from an informational standpoint, not from an administrative standpoint. And when I say an informational standpoint, I think that there's a need to create an inventory of what types of goods and services are needed at local levels, and that are not being provided satisfactorily by the private sector. So that's information that should be used for the purposes of trying to design a match between the types of work that people are doing and the requirements that exist in local communities. On the other hand, I definitely do not want decentralized administration of the program. And the New Deal is one example of a reason why you wouldn't want to have that kind of decentralization, particularly in a country that is so infused with racism as the United States. We have a long history of having programs that get decentralized programs with local administration that end up with deeply discriminatory practices. One of the strongest examples is the administration of the GI Bill, which was written into the law that it would be administered on a decentralized basis. And one of the consequences was, whether North or South, Black veterans did not receive benefits that approximated those that went to white veterans for the purposes of purchasing homes. So this is really, really, I'm very, very nervous about decentralized administration of a federal program. So I would say that what you might want to have are regional offices of some sort, but ultimately, the execution of the program has to be something that occurs at the federal level. While information can be gathered from localities about what their needs are, that's one thing. But the actual execution and operation of the program needs to be something that is centralized at the federal level.
So the job guarantee program has sometimes been criticized from the left. so MMT has been criticized sometimes from the left for the job guarantee program because it is a bit of a peculiar thing. On one hand, we want full employment. On the other hand, it's supposed to act as a downward anchor on wages to prevent, inflationary wage spirals, right?
No,
So
not from my perspective.
okay, I was wondering if you could go a little bit more into
My
detail, like what is
my argument about how the job guarantee can be a prop to inflation fighting is by eliminating the need for the Fed to be as concerned about the first of its dual mandates, which is preserving maximum employment. The federal job guarantee would preserve maximum employment. It would give us a zero unemployment rate because anyone who wanted a job could get a job. But I've never said that the pay for those positions should be low enough to drive down wages. Quite the contrary. I want the pay for those jobs, for the least well paid of those jobs, to be sufficient to put upward pressure on the compensation that the private sector is providing to all workers.
okay, thank you, that clarifies it. And then I was also wondering if you have any projections, any estimations of how many % of the population do you believe would eventually be employed in this program? And what would be sort of also from a social standpoint, what would be the social meaning of being employed in the job guarantee program? How do you see this playing out? Thanks.
So, so the number of people who would be employed would be contingent on the state of the economy. In some of the calculations that we did trying to project it, and this project the effects, and this might not be as substantive as some of the calculations that have been done at the Levy Institute, but we've assumed that we worked with a figure of 15 million people being hired under the job guarantee, because that's the highest number of people who were out of work during the course of the Great Recession. So we're thinking of that as being somewhat of an upper bound. Because there are certain kinds of jobs that will require continuity, then there would need to be a set of workers in the federal job guarantee program who were professionals who did not move in and out with changing circumstances. So there would have to be some core number of workers who were permanent employees of the federal program. But if we're thinking about a situation where we have a dramatic downturn in the economy, then we're talking about approximately 15 million people. If the expense, the average expense of a single employee is about $50,000, then we're talking about, I think, approximately $80 billion as the expense of the program for 15 million people. I hope I've got those numbers right. But we've typically talked about an annual expense that would max out probably in the vicinity of $100 billion or so. And that's kind of the expense side of it. In terms of the social consequences, I don't know. I mean, are you raising a question about whether people who had the public sector job would be stigmatized in some way? I've heard that argument made, but if
Yes.
it's
Sorry, I'm sorry. I guess no. I mean, I'm not trying to apply anything. I'm just wondering whether, because it seems like, you've worked on this from also a policy angle. What is your feeling of why do people support this program? What would be their, what would be sort of the social acceptability of being employed in a job guarantee program? How do you see this also playing out within Black communities? That's I guess the question, just from what you've seen in practice, sort of.
Well, I mean, I don't know in practice because we haven't done this for a long time. But my impression is that during the course of the Great Recession, there was no stigmatization associated with people taking jobs with the Works Progress Administration. I mean, the premise was, I think, people were desperate to find work, and here was an opportunity that the government was providing, and so they took advantage of it. And I think that's, I don't see how that's a stigma in and of itself. And insofar as it's a right for every citizen to have the option to take this type of work, I think that also reduces the stigmatizing effects that might be associated with it.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I think I'm gonna mix it up the things a little bit, but thinking the increase of the labor exploration at this time with this platform capitalism, things like that, can I set the job guarantee proposal, and it's a form to control, to limit the capital accumulation or the profits of the big companies?
I don't know. I honestly, I don't know. It's certainly, I mean, if you think the fact that they would have to raise the wages that they pay to their least well-paid workers, and that would have a significant effect on their profits, then yeah, then yes. If you believe in an economy in which higher wages actually generate higher profits because of the expansion in demand, then the answer is no. But I'm not sure, and it might be circumstantial. There may be conditions where one thing is true and the other is not. Let me also say, I've got to correct the numbers that I gave you. The cost of a program where the expense of hiring an individual worker was $50,000 and you hired 15 million people, that would be $850 billion rather than 80 billion. So the upper end expense for a program of this sort would be in the vicinity of $1 trillion. But if you had a highly prosperous economy, then the numbers of people who would be working under the program would be presumably considerably smaller, and the expense would be smaller. One of the things that I want to note is that the total expense associated with our various anti-poverty programs in the United States is about $800 billion. So to the extent that you could reduce those expenses, since the job guarantee would function as effectively as an anti-poverty program, then the burden, in quotes, of financing such a program would not be very different from the burden that's associated with financing existing programs. I say that not because I think that I very much embrace MMT, so I don't think that the government has to go out and get taxes to support these kinds of programs. But if you're in an inflationary environment, you do want to be careful about expanding expenditure. And so in that environment, to the extent that you can reduce another category of spending while you're raising the category to support the federal job guarantee, then that's a better policy in terms of trying to mitigate the inflationary effects of the new project.
Hi, I want to pick up on that, what you just said, because before you said that this job guarantee program would facilitate the Federal Reserve second mandate, which would be price stability. But if you have an economy running at full employment, that tends to be inflationary. So how this would facilitate the second mandate of the Fed in terms of maintaining price stability if you have an economy in permanent full employment, unless you have this coupled with an investment coordination policy, some sort of industrial or investment coordination policy, so that you will be also looking at the supply side.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it would tend to become inflationary, an inflationary economy, and it would not facilitate, rather the reverse. It would complicate the Federal Reserve's second mandate. That would be my thinking. I want your reaction to that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. You know, we'd probably have to do some kind of simulation, run the numbers to see how this would all pan out. But I'm not convinced that that there's some intrinsic inflationary effect associated with maintaining full employment. Okay, I mean, I think it's circumstantial. If you're in a position in which you're at full employment, and it does not mean that you have a barrier to further production.
If you have an investment policy, a coordinated investment policy, right?
Yeah,
The markets.
I don't disagree that that's probably a good idea. Remember, one of the points I made in my remarks was that what happened in the course of the pandemic was there was this substantial increase in expenditure by the federal government with no accompanying mechanism to ensure that aggregate supply would go up. Yeah, and so that's what you're saying. But I'm saying that the existence of full employment is not necessarily associated with a circumstance in which there can be no further increases in production.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So, you know, whether that requires some sort of industrial policy or something along those lines or not, we're not necessarily at full capacity when we're at full employment. In fact, I'm not sure there is any such thing as full capacity per se, but that's another argument.
Yeah, but even if you're not at full employment, you can be investing in too much in some areas and too little in others, and you still would have inflation, not even below full capacity. It means
Yes,
you have to coordinate investment.
Certainly, that is possible. Certainly, you know, I mean, the Fed could run an industrial policy. Yeah.
What?
Yeah, it could run an industrial policy by buying and selling stocks. I'm not sure we want the Fed to do that, but it is an option that the Fed has not pursued in any significant way, but it is an option. There are other policies the Fed could undertake. The Fed could undertake some forms of direct expenditure, you know, but and sort of it does indirect expenditure when it bails out the banks, but you know, the Fed can do whatever Congress tells it to do, and so it could run an industrial policy, but I'm not sure if we want the Federal Reserve to be involved in the process of buying stocks and bonds. So it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Thanks.
Just one question. What in your proposal would be the role of a universal basic income? Would this be like complementary with the job guarantee, or do you completely think this would not play a role?
So there are going to be individuals who are not able to work, literally.
But what about those who don't want to work?
If you don't want to work, you don't want to work. I mean, but we could have some form of an income guarantee for everybody, which would presumably for individuals who could take the job option, which might be lower than the amount that they could receive from taking the job. I definitely don't think we want people to starve because they choose not to work, but that, you know, that's a choice, right? But there is an attachment to the value of work associated with thinking about a federal job guarantee. There is some premise that it is useful to human beings to have the opportunity to engage in paid work. You know, so maybe I'm too bound up with the social modes of thought that are connected to the world in which we live, but I don't think people should be compelled to take jobs. But I certainly think that there's a potential social value to having jobs available in which people perform tasks that are going to be beneficial for the society at large.
Hi, so I just want to clarify your remarks on kind of like accepting that Fed rate hikes are a necessary way of fighting inflation at this point. Do you mean that in the sense that you don't think supply side stuff is politically viable or not gonna be effective quickly enough, or you don't think it would be effective at all? And then on the other side is what do you think about credit regulation as an alternative to rate hikes to check demand?
So my concern about the supply response is that I'm just not certain it will happen quickly enough. I certainly think it's desirable to do that because obviously in the long term, to the extent that we can ensure that there's increased goods and services and presumably in appropriate areas, that reduces inflationary pressures, but it's a question of timing. And so you know, unless we think that there can be a rapid supply response, that you know, that the infrastructure could be in place and the private sector to substantially increase output, that it would be increases in output in areas that we don't think are going to be socially dangerous. You know, all of those issues come into play. So I've been thinking that are only if we don't have the capacity to rapidly change the amount of production in the economy, our only policy option for containing inflation is to use high interest rate policy. Credit regulation, I'm not sure what the relationship is you have in mind between credit regulation and inflation control.
Yeah, I just mean that you know, if the transmission mechanism for rate hikes is you decrease lending and investment, a way that you could do that kind of more directly is by curtailing, you know, certain forms of credit that are deemed, you know, not as socially desirable, and just directly curtail credit and demand that way.
So what are, you know, what are the examples that you have in mind? I mean, I guess I can think of some, but I'd love to hear what you're thinking of.
It's a good question. I mean, you know, Nathan Tankis and Our Money put out a report a few months ago that goes into this, and you know, it's a very broad framework and didn't get too much into specific details on like, you know, where you would do that. But I mean, you know, the classic example is like well, we probably don't need to be approving loans to build casinos right now, you know, so it just frivolous stuff like that.
Okay, I'm not sure. I mean, you know, you've got Native American tribes that rely heavily upon resources that are generated from casinos. So maybe we don't need a new one, but I'm not going to view casinos as entirely frivolous, depending upon, you know, who receives the revenues from them. So it's that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how we decide exactly what's frivolous and what isn't. Now maybe that's the advantage of the conventional Fed high interest rate policy, is it doesn't necessarily target any specific sector. But I certainly, you know, in an environment where climate change has been generated by the fossil fuels industry, I certainly could understand making a case for trying to restrict credit flows to that sector, but that would mean that their production would go down, and that would mean in turn that unless we had built into our system alternative forms of transportation, which is something that's possible with a federal job guarantee, that you know, we wouldn't really be doing much to curb inflation. So you know, somebody mentioned people having to travel long distances to do work under the Works Progress Administration, and I was thinking that that's another area of employment under the public sector, which is the folks who provide the transportation services for the folks who are working in the federal job guarantee positions. I mean, I think that this is a project that could really change the quality of American life, and so we'd have to see. But yeah, I don't know about the direct credit control strategy as being necessarily superior. Again, this gets back to, do we want to have an industrial policy? Do we want the federal government to be deciding who are the sunshine industries and who are the sunset industries? And this is a strategy that was pursued in East Asia by a number of countries during the period where there was a substantial economic boom in, you know, locations like Korea and the like. They were pursuing an industrial policy essentially, and I'm not sure. You know, that's worth exploring.
If I could just chime in, I don't think credit regulations necessarily have to refer to sectoral or industrial directions, but it could also be things like higher down payment requirements, higher collateral requirements, or certain types of collateral, or maybe like limits on maturity, just the kinds of things that are meant to decrease consumer credit generally, to decrease consumption spending.
So
investment spending.
I'm not that anxious to restrict consumer credit as I am to try to reduce the amount of credit that goes to the corporate sector as a mechanism for trying to control inflation. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask you a question about what you said in your previous comments. You implied that higher wages would lead to higher profits. In post-Keynesian economics, there is a distinction between.
No. I said there are circumstances in which that might be the case.
Okay.
I didn't say that's always the case.
Okay. So, but yeah, in post-Keynesian economics, there's a distinction between wage-led and profit-led economies.
Right.
So I was wondering, is your argument that if we implement these kinds of policies, we would have just wage-led economies, basically? Thank you.
No, I'm not sure of that. Again, I think it's conditional, and I'm not sure what the full range of conditions are. You know, Lance Taylor did a lot of work. Lance was my senior advisor when I was a graduate student, he did a lot of work on stagnationist versus exhilarationist economies. And I think that that's precisely the distinction you're making between economies that are in some sense wage-led versus profit-led. To the extent that you have a private corporate structure, you're going to always have to ask what the relationship is between wages and profits. I mean, this is Ricardo's fundamental question. But I'm not sure what the direction is. I mean, I can imagine circumstances in which wages are rising and profits are rising. I can imagine circumstances in which increased wages actually compress profits. And I think we have to be very cognizant of what type of environment we're in, because the same economy at different points in time might be structurally different in terms of that relationship. So I don't want to make a claim about what the direct effects would be of the job guarantee on profits. I'm not entirely sure. Like I said, if you believe that raising wages and benefits for folks who are at the lowest end of the wage distribution would reduce profits for the private sector, then the federal job guarantee would lower profits. If you believe that sustained employment and sustained consumer spending actually enhances profits, then that would be a profit benefit associated with the job guarantee. So I'm not sure, since both things would be in play, I'm not sure what would be dominant. I don't know.
Earlier you said if we cannot rapidly increase supply, I'm paraphrasing, but if we cannot rapidly increase supply to deal with the inflation, our only policy for controlling inflation is the rate increases of the Fed. But why not price controls? Apart from whatever political feasibility or infeasibility of them, why wouldn't price controls do that as well?
Because price controls ultimately just repress the inflation, and it would be manifest eventually.
That's it? That's the answer? There's no more to it? It's that simple?
Yeah.
In other words, there's no other nuance. That's your answer. That's it. Done.
I mean, I presume, are you talking about price controls without wage controls? Are you talking about wage controls and price controls?
I'm asking you. You have the PhD.
I have the PhD, but that's not a condition for absolute knowledge by any means.
Well,
and
you've got more than me. You've got more than me. I'm asking.
But I'm trying to ask, what is the type of controls policy you have in mind? Are you including wage controls?
I would include whatever works. I'm reacting to you saying our only, and that is a direct quote, right? I'm paraphrasing the rest, but you said our only policy option is rate increases. We have controlled inflation before with price controls.
Wage and price controls. And the only time we did it was during the course of World War II.
Okay. And it worked.
Yes, during the course of World War II. I'm not sure that it would work in circumstances in which there's not this national emergency that's associated with trying to win a war.
Okay, so but all right. Some people would argue we are already in the national.
Oh, we're always
emergency.
In some type of national emergency. There's no question.
Okay.
But
all right,
we are not fighting. We are not sending troops into a world war situation at the moment.
Right. I guess I'm reacting to the categorical statement that our only policy for controlling inflation is rate increases, when in fact we know there are other policy options. And I presume the whole point of being a heterodox economist is to look at possibilities and see what is possible. But saying our only policy.
So as a non-PhD, you've made an excellent point. I should have qualified what I said, and I should have said that I perceive that the only viable policy is the interest rate policy as a mechanism for controlling inflation. My preference would be to have designed any new expenditure program in such a way that it anticipated the prospect of inflation and was structured in such a way that it minimized the inflation risk. But insofar as we are in a situation where we're experiencing inflation, I should have made the argument that I think in the present moment, the only viable policy is to rely upon the Fed's interest rate strategy. Now, yes, wage and price controls have been attempted in the past, and they were effective during World War II. I don't think that they can be effective in general. And so it's not that it's not a policy option. It's just that from my perspective, it's not a good policy option.
Thank you so much. I was just curious to hear your thoughts on the implications or sort of possibilities of the job guarantee for our education system, either in the United States or abroad, just sort of what you might foresee in terms of impacts or potential possibilities. Thanks.
I think I mentioned the idea that some of the employees under a federal job guarantee could be positioned as aides in classrooms. There may be individuals who are currently school teachers who actually choose to take a federal job guarantee, given the level of pay that our teachers are receiving. And then that would raise the question as to whether or not they might continue doing some form of teaching themselves. But I would see the federal job guarantee as providing additional resources to for public education purposes, whether it's individuals who are working as the primary classroom teacher or as supplementary staff. I also would envision the federal job guarantee as providing the labor that providing some of the labor that would enable us to actually improve the infrastructure of our existing schools and perhaps build new structures as well. So from that standpoint, there's a potential benefit for the educational process in the United States. Another angle to think about is the potential training that could be received by individuals who become employees in the job guarantee. If you told me to go out and work with a crew on building a bridge tomorrow, I would have no idea what to do. PhD notwithstanding, I would have to be trained. And so there's a variety of employments that would exist under the federal job guarantee that individuals would have to be trained to do. And I think the training dimension would be especially important for the human infrastructure side of things, the provision of child and elder care. So there's an educational dimension that would be built directly into the job guarantee program, because people would need to be given the skills to perform many of the tasks that they would be called upon to do under the job guarantee. So those are the the directions I see. I don't know. Do you have other thoughts?
No, yeah, I was just curious to get your input. And that makes sense. I guess the one follow-up would just be with the kind of educational training, if that's envisioned to be part of the sort of centralized administration of the program, or if that would also take place sort of in the sites of work. Maybe that's been answered in proposals and I can read more, but I think you answered my question.
Yeah. Well, the training would have to be localized because people would need to have access to the training sites. But the determination of what type of training would be given and the hiring of the individuals to provide that type of education would have to be something that was done on a more centralized or at least a regional basis.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for taking all this time and having this interactive session. I've heard some inklings of people proposing, in kind of high inflation situations, one new tool, and I don't know if this would, fall under the purview of Congress or the Fed, but like a mandatory 4-day work week. Is that something that you've done any work on or would have any general thoughts on as an antidote for inflation? Thank you.
No, that's intriguing. I have not done any work on that at all.
Although we were supposed to talk about job guarantee, a number of points have been raised about inflation, and you appear to be subscribing to the Milton Friedman's definition that it's too much money chasing too few goods. And I'd wanted to draw your attention to Blair Fix, who wrote an article about inflation and how it's badly measured. And so when we're talking about trying to control inflation, do we even know what it is? Now, his argument, based on research by Jonathan Nitzen, is that perhaps we don't really know how to measure it, and perhaps we don't know what we're talking about.
Well, I'm not really sure how to respond to that. I mean,
well, have you looked at Blair Fix's research?
Did we have a hyperinflation in Germany or not? I mean, you're saying that because we had difficulty measuring it, we couldn't really tell?
We had a hyperinflation in Germany for very different reasons than what Milton Friedman talked about.
I'm not talking about the reasons. I'm talking about the issue you raised about measurement.
Yeah, but I'm talking about.
But you said do we even know what inflation is? Okay, so the way in which the numbers that I reported are based specifically on the consumer price index. If you have complaints about the consumer price index, then by all means,
it's not
let's see if there's a better measure. Another point I want to make is I tried to talk about different rates of inflation in different sectors of the economy, because I think that that's really critical. This aggregate measure of the inflation rate doesn't really tell us where it's occurring. And so I think it's always important to talk about the specific sectors. And so I tried to do that as well. I think it's unambiguously the case that prices are increasing in the present moment at rates much, much higher than any point since the Volcker era. Now, in terms of the question of cause and effect, I always thought that Milton Friedman's position was that inflation is always a monetary phenomenon, and that it's driven by the money supply, and that is not what I'm saying. I'm saying something quite different. I am saying that inflation is a product of aggregate demand outstripping aggregate supply.
Well, you might like to look at the article by Blair Fix. He's an economist in Canada, and he talks about the truth of, it's called The Truth About Inflation, and he talks about it being always and everywhere a phenomenon of structural change, which is quite friendly to what you just said.
Okay, I will take a look. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I have two questions. One is that you said that 98% of the Democratic and 63% of the Republican is actually agreed on the
No,
no?
78% of Democratic Party voters and 53% of Republican Party voters
Yeah,
endorse the
that-
federal job guarantee.
right? And then they agreed on the job guarantee program. And then, so what is the kind of the primary object reasons why the job guarantee program is still not adopted in the US? And that is my first question. Second question is really like regarding about the implementation mechanism. So you said like any expenditure program should be designed in consideration with the inflationary pressure. I think in my understanding, so that now that, you know, in terms of that, maybe governments have to, you know, grasp the real available resources all the time. But I think that, you know, any government in any country cannot do it right now. But what is kind of the maybe like, what do you, what is the necessary function for the government and how do the government to do it? Like, you know, for example, maybe through by like establishing another department to understand the real resources or something like that. I think, yeah, that is my question.
Please remind me of the first question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, first question is what is the kind of the primary object reasons against the job guarantee program in the US Congress?
I'm not entirely sure, but my speculation is that there is significant resistance to the job guarantee from the private sector. And our congressional representatives, for the most part, remain prisoners of the private sector. So that's the real political challenge is how do we make our political process, our elected officials respond to majority sentiment in the United States rather than be controlled and regulated by the minority. And I think the job guarantee is a particularly salient policy for recognizing that problem because there is widespread support for the job guarantee, but there's very little congressional action on its behalf. So I think it's because, you know, corporate America is fundamentally resistant to it, and it's resistant to it because it knows that it will eliminate its capacity to engage in having the threat of unemployment as a weapon, and also because it will put upward pressure on the compensation for labor. So it would really remix the power dynamic between labor and capital. And so that's my speculation that's the central reason. I think your second question was about how do you design programs so that you can mitigate the inflation risk?
Yeah, it's kind of how do you implement job guarantee program? I mean, like, how do you, for the government to actually to know that, you know, real available resources in order to mitigate the inflationary pressure?
So I think the key thing that I've been focused on is associated with what we conventionally refer to as the public goods problem. And I've in some work that I did for a report for the Roosevelt Institute on the public sector as a potential competitor with the private sector, I've argued that the desirable attributes of goods must be adequate quantity, adequate quality, and accessibility. And so if we have goods that are socially desirable, but they're not available in sufficient quantity, quality, or accessibility, then those are the goods that should be a focal point for the productive activities of the federal job guarantee program. In the report that we did on that issue, we made an attempt to try to identify some specific types of goods and services that are not provided adequately by the private sector, and those should be the priority areas for the type of employment and work that's going to be done under the job guarantee. Now, identification of those goods is ultimately, once again, something that would have to be determined by a political process. And again, we would have to be very concerned that that political process is one that is in effect controlled by the majority, as opposed to a minority like a corporate cabal.
Hi, and thank you. Do you distinguish in the structure of the job guarantee program, do you foresee supporting work that is part of, let's say, unfunded or underfunded federal programs, or more like work that would traditionally be funded by local programs? So like you mentioned the post office, and I'm like, well, if we need a jobs guarantee program to support the post office, that means that's an underfunded federal program.
Mhm.
And I think if, so are we thinking about targeting programs that would typically be funded by local, state and local institutions, where we could actually use federal funding where the funding doesn't exist right now at the state or local level? Thank you.
I think both. I think both. I think that the local considerations come into play when we think about taking an inventory of what local needs might be. But I also think that to the extent that employment in the federal job guarantee could provide us with the capacity to provide greater support for underfunded federal programs, so be it. I think I said at one point that the limits to our options with a job guarantee are set only by the scope of our imagination, and so there's no reason why the job guarantee can't address needs at the federal and the local level. Now, an interesting thing about the postal system, of course, is it is well, it's semi-privatized now, for the worse, but it has local outlets, local offices, local branches. Even though it is technically a federal program, and so there are local implications to providing employment support to the post office, to the postal system.
Sandy will take the last question.
Okay. These questions, these have been some tough ass questions.
Mine will be easier, I promise. You said, I'm pretty sure if I understood you correctly, you said that you want nationally administered job guarantee,
Yeah.
and in my learning MMT, it's been pretty assertive that it is nationally funded, locally administered. So that's a conflict. I mean, conflict. I don't mean conflict. That is different. And I understand that you said it could, at local, in significant amount of local places, that local administration could result in virulent racism. And that seems obvious to me. So my question is how do you, number one, how do you avoid national racism? How do you manage abuse in general for policies such as a job guarantee? Not just racism, but abuse in general. Racism is an enormous part of it. And I think more generically is what disadvantages and advantages do you see in administering a job guarantee at a local level as opposed to a national level?
So, my view is that if you have a series of locally administered programs of any type, you're going to have to play whack-a-mole in a way in which you don't have to at the federal level. If there's something that goes wrong and you are in a position to appeal directly to the federal level, that's very different from having to fight this thing out in multiple municipalities. So I think also, it was well understood at the point at which the GI Bill was adopted that if there was federal administration, there was much less likely to be a situation in which Black veterans would be treated differently from white veterans. Of course, that's a possibility, in this country in particular. But if that were the case, then it would have been possible to lodge complaints directly about discrimination in the program at the federal level, instead of having to try to struggle with this on each individual locality, where the local authorities fully had discretion. The law provided them with that type of discretion. And if the law doesn't provide that kind of discretion, that discretion still can be taken if you have local administration, and then you would have to fight with each locality where folks are misbehaving. I'd rather direct the complaints to a single site, which would be the federal government, in the event that something goes wrong in those directions.
Thank you very, very much, Sandy.
Thanks for having me and giving me the chance to talk with you all.